Sup Shredders, my name is Logan aka Spiderhands and welcome to an SP Reviews where today we have ourselves a track from an act named Syawolf titled Selfish Freestyle. And if we switch over to here, it is on Spotify, so we're going to listen through this track from start to finish and we're going to hear what we think. Let's go.
I've been thinking for a while, I've been coming up with wild shit. I can picture you with nobody, you know I'm selfish. I just need to hold you close, jealous type, you know, helping me. Not angry, just passionate, throwing hits, you ain't catching me. All these claims, but I'm backing it, in that pussy I'm backing it. Like a bitch on accident, shit got you different. On me, you will never find another me, that's one promise I'ma keep. Hope you understand me when I speak.
I don't mean to interrupt the song for the sake of vanity. I simply am going to just try and sort of point some stuff out very occasionally. Don't worry, I won't pause too much. But what I want to give a shout out to is just how you have that sort of record skip starting the track at the start, sets the scene for a story, an interesting mood. The ambient guitar parts of the vocals kind of washed into the mix as if it's the thoughts in a person's own head kind of being really solemnly but carefully told to you. The nice sort of leveling of the drums and such. It's a really fascinating mix. It's good so far.
Don't remember that happened. I ain't even talking about that shit. What you wanna know about the bitch? It was never nothing serious. Why you so unserious? Can't believe I'm hearing this. See why your last nigga left. Don't know nigga won't deal with this. Alright, I'm sorry for slipping, saying too much. Sometimes I get mad cause I wish it was only us. They ain't fucking with us. Love over lust. I've been thinking for a while, I've been coming up with wild shit. I can treat you with nobody, you know I'm selfish. I just need to hold you close, jealous type, you know helping me. Not angry, just passionate, not angry, just passionate. I can't live fuck with me, I get. I can't live fuck with me, I get. I can't live fuck with me, I get. I can't.
I'm going to be honest, I actually quite like that track. I don't feel the need to say that. It's just, I think it's really well done. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Because this is the conclusion of my review of this track from an act named Syawolf titled Selfish Freestyle. Now, what do I think this track is about? I think this track is about someone who has been in sort of a relationship or a situation with someone else, and they're discussing their side of things. You know, that selfish freestyle, it's basically talking about their own feelings and what they want. And maybe they're feeling as if they are expecting too much from the other person. You know, I remember the line he said, he wishes it was only about us, you know, that he didn't want anyone else involved. It almost seems to me like he's trying to explain, look, I just want to level with you and be emotionally kind of like transparent with you about this. And there's a sort of romanticism to that. The way that it was wrapped, you know, I mean, there was more to it obvious than that, but that's the main message I got from the story. That the vocal performance displayed someone who wasn't trying to front. They were simply trying to connect with the person on a more intimate and honest level, which I always appreciate. I think that it can be tremendously risky to show, I suppose, weakness or to admit you're wrong about stuff, but I will always respect people, especially if they make a song about it where they can just say that to the world, you know? That said, I also don't think it's a mistake to want a person to yourself personally, though. That's my own personal opinion, of course, you know, everyone's entitled to theirs. But at least from what I got about it, it simply was someone who wanted to have something special with the other and to not have the complications involved, and maybe they felt guilty about it. And this was honestly seemed like more of a confessional, I suppose. And I think that was good for several reasons. One, again, because of the way he rapped it, he vocalized, he communicated with the audience. It was soft and soothing, and I think that was appropriate for the subject matter. If it had been aggressive or apathetic, obviously that would have ruined it. So there was a clear awareness on how to express ourselves to suit the mood of the lyrics. But I think also, in addition to the vocal performance, where we were articulate and the words did come through clearly, even though there was a lot of misty reverb going on, which kind of left it to kind of sift within the other elements of the mix. What I enjoyed is that the story was short and we allowed ourselves to not be the focal point the entire time. I really appreciate when musicians can allow an accompaniment to introduce itself and then they come in on top of it and then they gracefully and respectfully just like step off, like to allow the piano at the end to kind of filter out. I thought that was great. But if we get into the track itself, at 1 minute 33, this is one of the shortest tracks I reviewed in a while. And it's below the 2 to 4 minute sweet spot that I usually expect for tracks or for people on first listen basis. And do you know what? I don't really mind. I don't really mind that. I think that if you can communicate the message and the story that you want to in the space of less than 2 minutes, then that's awesome, because what it does is it doesn't then mean you have to fill it up with stuff that could just be filler. I've heard songs where people have had a minute of storytelling and then they have let that motif repeat for an entire minute or minute and a half afterwards. And it's rough, man, because it's like, I get it. You like the sound of your main sort of musical theme here, but if you repeat it without additions or development or adjustments, it almost becomes a little bit monotonous and it's easy for listeners to lose interest. And so what I appreciate is that we had, again, the record kind of go back in place to start the track. We had, the guitar, bass, drums, keys, etc. come into play early on. I mean, the piano was a little bit more prominent later on, but we had each of these instruments play really effective, almost minimalist parts that niched well on top of each other. And we just had the vocals sitting nice and neatly within that, also not trying to be too much. Da 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 dun 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 dun. Like that rhythm was repeated there, and there was a clear understanding that we needed to repeat that rhythmic motif with our vocals as well. We had a bit of coloration to it, like there was a melody to it, which was great as well, because especially with the rest of the track being so colorful, it's good to have that little bit of extra adjustment there to suit. But I think with the way, it's not only the fact that we understood how to niche these instruments and we didn't have any filler and that the track was short and sweet and a great first impression, at least in terms of the length, it's also not only what the instruments were doing, but how they sounded. So the guitars had a great, again, I mentioned the word mistiness to them, as if we're looking through our own head and we've done some introspection. That's the only reason why we're talking about the stuff in the first place. We've been thinking about it, and this is what we want to say to that person, right? And so the guitars had a nice, pleasant, minor-esque... No, it rolled around the major triads, actually. I take that back. There was a simple minor-major kind of effect to the guitars there, which was very pretty, and it was a nice, bright contrast to the bass line, which was in that low end, just providing a sort of a floor for everything to stand on. The drums were interesting. Like, we had cymbals on the far sides, like the hi-hat, so that was surrounding you and giving a sense of sort of stereo width. But also the drums, I think if we'd had a more clicky kick, it wouldn't have been appropriate. It would have been too sharp. And it was almost like we were filtering the drums by having mostly the low end kind of sub resonating there. And that allowed for the other elements to kind of sit out on top. And when the vocals were submerged a little bit in the mix, the kick didn't really, even if it's sidechained, it wasn't boosting into that frequency range or frequency spectrum, which was good. I think the piano at the end, or like whenever it appeared, basically added a little bit of color in that mid-range there, which I enjoyed there. Some melodies to exist on top of the existing chord progression and bass line that the other instruments had introduced. But it was regal enough on its own to sort of allow us to go out with it. And I think that was a nice transition, like a handing over of the microphone to like the piano as a lead. I think that was a smart idea, because it's good to have, obviously it's good to have space in a composition and to not have vocals all the time, but you can still have another lead element there beside it. So that was I liked that. But the theme that we had there was more like, I kind of imagine it kind of waking up on a sunny day, making a coffee, just writing a letter to this person. That's how it makes me think. It's almost nostalgic. It's got a warmth and like a gentle fuzziness to it. It's not a sharp mix that's meant to grab your attention. It's there to kind of allow you to sort of simmer in that experience that's being provided to you. I think that with that in mind, with the way that the instruments niched not only from their parts, I mean, obviously the drum kit had an interesting rhythm to it as well, but that was mostly repeated throughout as like a constant thing to give more focus to the change within the vocals, lyrics and stuff like that, as well as the lead elements there. The fact that the instruments were playing things that niched well together, in addition to the fact that they just tonally and texturally niched well in contrasts, led to an accompaniment that worked. And yeah, I understand why things were done the way they were. The studio recording, mixing and mastering, you know, with a track like this, which is quite somber and contemplative, you really need to find a way, in my opinion, to not saturate it with effects and overproduce it, but also give it in a sort of ethereal sense of, hey, this is sort of like this is us considering stuff within our heads. This is a very open thing, but it's like kind of almost like a dream sequence, if that makes sense. It's got that kind of vibe to it where if it's too blunt, it'll just be like you're literally having a conversation with someone, and I think that it would be almost a little bit too on the nose. So I think that we handled that contrast here, with the vocals being a little bit they were quite deep in the mix there, but they were still, even with the reverb change and effects added to it, it still sounded like a reasonably raw performance there. And because of the filtering and EQing, you still hear them clearly. The bass and the drums were more like low key, so they weren't going to affect that part of the frequency spectrum. The guitar and the keys simmering on top were great mid to high range resonances there, so the frequency spectrum was handled well. Things were nice and wide in the stereo field, again with the aforementioned hi-hats and cymbals on the sides there, as well as the other percussive elements kind of rolling around the stereo field. Whether they were panned or they were just positioned like that, I'm not sure, but either way it worked. The things were nicely leveled in the mix with the consideration of what I said earlier about the levels and how it can make you listen more closely. There was dynamic range to it. You know, when the pianos came in at the end, it was a little bit quieter, a little more sort of like, it was enough for like where things weren't super intense in your face in the first place, where there was that kind of mid-range kind of maybe small changes to the dynamics, but it was enough because we weren't being overwhelmed by it half the time for it to still work. The way that it sounded at the beginning made sense for it to not need a whole huge amount of dynamic range, but it still gave us some anyways, and I appreciate that. Finally, it was nice and low without pumping, so the bus compression and limiting was handled well. I mean, effectively, this is my review of this track from Syawolf titled Selfish Freestyle, and hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please go show them some love via their various social medias and their Spotify page, and stay cool and stay safe, and please remember to support your local musicians and artists at this point in time, as either hell more than ever thought of crazy stuff going on in the world, and I'll catch you in the next review. Spiderhands out.